Shalom everyone, Ezrat Hashem. Today we are going to learn Gimel Amud Bet in Masechet Sanhedrin, and we're going to start a little bit back where we finished off yesterday at Shlosha Min Alan, the fourth line on the page. Ezrat Hashem, our learning should be as a refuah shlema for Yaakov ben Dina. We should hear of his speedy recovery soon in our days. Now, we're going to go back a little bit to the beginning of the sugya where we just started yesterday at the end of the shiur. Before we see this inside, I'd like to show you the psukim in Parashat Mishpatim that we're really going to focus on today. Really, we're going to have two sections today. First, we'll show a machloket, which we began yesterday, regarding the need for three people in a monetary court, what the source for that is, and we'll explain that debate. And the second section we'll deal with is actually a machloket, if you need 3 or 5 for a monetary court. That's going to be a machloket Rebbi and the Tanakam. We'll get to that in the second section of the day today. Now, before we see the Gemara inside, I want to mention the psukim we're going to discuss. If we look in Parashat Mishpatim, Perek Chaf Bet, Pasuk Zayin. So this is the Parashat of Shomrim. We've mentioned this before, but the verse reads, Pasuk Zayin, Im lo yimatzeh haganav v'nikrav ba'al habayit el ha'elohim. Pasuk says, the ba'al habayit will bring the shomer to the court because the shomer is claiming that he's not responsible, and the ba'al habayit has to make him swear, essentially, as the psukim discuss. Now, that's the first time it says Elohim. Then you look at the next pasuk, Pasuk Chet, and it mentions Elohim 2 more times. If you look towards the end of the verse, it says, Ad Elohim yavod dvar shnehem, that till the judges, their matter will come, Asher yashiyun Elohim yishalem shnaim l'rei'eyu. And if the judges will indict this fellow, so then he'll have to pay double, which is kefil, which we've discussed as well. So the point is, the verse Elohim is written 3 times. This word Elohim is written in these verses 3 times. We know the word Elohim there does not mean Hashem's name, but rather it is the name to refer to judges. And based on these psukim, we're going to have both sections today. The source for this idea of monetary courts requiring 3, perhaps Rebbi's going to say 5, we'll get to later. But Bezat Hashem, let's get started. The 4th line of the page on Gimel Amud Bet. Shlosha Min Alan. Says the Gemara, we learned in the Mishnah the source for the 71-person Sanhedrin Agdolah. We also learned the source for the number 23 in the lower capital courts. But what is the source that monetary courts have to have 3 judges? To Tanu Rabanan, so the Braita teaches as follows. This is the first opinion of Yoshiya. V'nikrav ba'al habayit el Elohim, the psukim we just saw. The first pasuk says the owner of the item will bring the shomer to court, Elohim, to the judges. Harei kan echad, that's one mention of the judges. Ad Elohim yavod dvar shnehem, the second, which is the next pasuk, pasuk chet, till the judges, the matter will be brought, the matter of both of them. Harei kan shnayim, so you see there's 2 judges. Asher yashiyun Elohim, and then the third, which is really in the same pasuk, pasuk chet there, that the judges will indict, will make guilty, Harei kan shlosha. So now you have 3 judges, 3 references, Elohim means 3 judges. This is talking about monetary scenarios of Shomrim, it's talking about monetary cases. Devi Reb Yoshiya, according to Reb Yoshiya, this is the source that monetary cases need to be adjudicated by 3 judges. Good. Reb Yonatan Omer, Reb Yonatan disagrees. He says, I agree with you, you need 3, but I expound it from a different capacity. What is it? It says like this, Rishon Tchila Ne'emar. The first time it says Elohim, and Nikra ba'al habayit el Elohim, Tchila Ne'emar. So that's the initial or opening statement, and it needed to say that. Ve'ein dorshin tchilot. And we do not expound the opening statement. So Rashi explains, and we'll see more in the Gemara momentarily, it had to write Elohim the first time to teach us a different halacha. What's that? It had to teach us that they needed to be, as we've mentioned already, smuchin, mumchin, they need to be professional. Elohim, Rashi learns the lashon of gedula, of rabbanut, of authority. So it had to write Elohim the first time, says Rabbi Yonatan, in order to teach us that idea. You can't expound that first Elohim to teach us the idea of the number, because it's not written for that purpose. It's only written then. It's necessary to write it in order to teach us, bichlal, they have to be professional. So you can't expound the first Elohim for the number 3. Rather, how we'll expound it is as follows. Ada Elohim Yavod Dvar Shneim, the second time it says Elohim Arekan Echad. That would mean one judge. Asher Yashun Elohim, the second one, which is in the same pasuk actually as that last one, which is the third time it's mentioned, but we use it actually in the drasha for the number, says Rabbi Yonatan. Arekan Shnaim, that would mean there's two judges for monetary cases. But continues Rabbi Yonatan, still I know there has to be three judges for monetary cases. Why? Because ve'ein beitin shakul, we learned earlier, and we're going to mention this more later, is that we know you can't have a court that is of equal number. Because the pasuk says, Acharei rabim la'atot, it has to be able to tilt based on the majority to paskin halacha and innocent at least. And therefore, we know that there has to be an odd number so that you can have a majority to tilt in one direction. So you can't have an even court. And if the psukim only then imply that there's two judges for monetary cases, obviously the minimum would have to be Mosifin alei and odechad, that we would add one more based on the logic that it has to be an odd number. Harekan shlosha. And therefore, says Rabbi Yonatan, even though I don't expound the first one for the number, I still would know that there's three, because if there's two, it can't be two, because you need an odd number to tilt in the side of faith, in the side of one of the opinions. Therefore, it has to be that there's a minimum of three for monetary cases. Now, that's the end of the Braita. So both Rabbi Yoshiya and Rabbi Yonatan agree that you need three for a monetary court. The question is, how do they arrive at that conclusion? According to Rabbi Yoshiya, how does he know it? It says the word Elohim 3 times. He is allowed to expound the first one for number, and therefore you need three judges in monetary cases, which is what the Psukim and Mishpatim are talking about. According to Rabbi Yoshiya, you can't expound the first one because that's necessary, bichlal, just to teach us in general the idea that you need professional judges, appointed judges, smuchin. So therefore you can only expound the latter two. But if there's only two, you'll have an even court, which you're not allowed to have because then it won't tilt on one side. Mele, you need another one, logically, and you need a minimum of three. That's the machloket. So the Gemara now analyzes this debate and says as follows. Neima, let us suggest v'darshin tchilot kamiflagi, that it would appear this machloket, Rabbi Yoshiya and Rabbi Yonatan, is based on the principle if you're allowed to expound the first place this word appears, and in general this seems to be a debate. Could you expound the first time the word appears for the number you're trying to deduce or not? Demar Savar, that Rabbi Yoshiya holds darshin tchilot. You could expound the first time, and it's included in the number. Umar Savar and Rabbi Yonatan holds ein darshin tchilot, that you can't expound the first time for the number because it's used for something else to teach us that you need professional judges, and therefore you'd only know 2 plus 1 because it would otherwise be even. That's how you would know 3. Now the Gemara does not want to say this because the Gemara seems to hold that it's much more logical that we're not darshin tchilot, meaning in general, if you have a word appear multiple times and you want to expound a number, the first time is necessary for some other drasha in general, and therefore it shouldn't be allowed to be used for whatever number you're trying to expound. So therefore what the Gemara says is lo. No. Tekuli alma ein darshin tchilot. Really, everyone agrees that you cannot expound the first number the first time it appears for the number. And therefore Rabbi Yoshiya would concede actually you should not theoretically be allowed to use it for the number of 3 in these psukim, for the number of judges in a monetary case. However, Rabbi Yoshiya says, I have a reason to believe this should be different than general, and you should still be allowed to expound it for the number, even though it's the first time it appears. Why is it different? So Rabbi Yoshiya says to you, in Cain, because if it was not to be expounded for number, and it was only there to teach us you need professional judges, Neimakra v'nikrav balabayit el shofet. It could have said in the first time it appears in Pasuk Zayin that the balabayit will bring him, the shomer, to the shofet. Shofet also means professional judges. It didn't have to use the word Elohim the first time. It could have just said shofet, and I would know that you need to approach the judges, and I would also know that they need to be professional judges because shofet, says Rabbi Yoshiya, also implies professional judges. Why does the pasuk go out of its way to say Elohim? Ma'el Elohim. Why does it need to say it the first time? I know they're professional from the second and third time it says it. The fact that it emphasizes Elohim the first time unnecessarily, and shofet would have just as good of an exchange. So from that we deduce that not only is it to be used for its first appearance to teach us the idea, which is really emphasized in the second and third time, that it's professional judges, appointed judges, but on top of that it's also utilized for the number. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yonatan responds to that and he says, no, that's not true. He says, Lishna de almanakat. Really, the pasuk just took the general language. Kida amri inchi, like people say, man de itle dina, someone that has a court case, likarev legabe dayana. They should go to the general, to the judges. As Rashi explains, this is just the normal way to speak. Meaning to say is that when you want it, like people say, when they're referring to judges, so you say dayana, judges. But in the context here, the way to say professional judges is to say Elohim. Shofet would not cover that, and therefore the first time it appears, actually it needs to say Elohim, so as to imply that they're professional judges. Therefore Rabbi Yonatan disagrees with Rabbi Yoshiya. It's not there for the number. It's only like people say Dayana, which means professional judges. Elohim brings out that principle, and if it wouldn't have said Elohim, you wouldn't know that principle. So therefore it has to say Elohim the first time to teach this idea. It wouldn't be appropriate to teach something else like Shofet, and therefore it's not able to be utilized for the number 3. You can only use the letter 2 for 3 for the number, and there you add one more because you can't have an even court. Beautiful. Let's continue. Now, Gemara continues and makes the following assumption. So let's just speak out what we have so far. Rabbi Yoshiya is comfortable learning from the fact that it says Elohim 3 times, that you have 3 judges in a monetary court. Rabbi Yonatan holds only 2 of those times are able to be used for the number. The first time is not able to be used for the number because it needed to say that Bichlal to teach us the idea that you have professional judges, smuchin, when it comes to a monetary court case. So as Rashi explains here, it would appear that Rabbi Yoshiya, without the 3rd time, the first time that it says it means to have a total of 3, he wouldn't know you need 3 judges for a monetary court case. Now, Rabbi Yonatan doesn't need 3 times because as long as you have 2 that are deduced from the verses, you're not able to have an even court because it has to be able to be imbalanced, and therefore he knows you tack on 1 more. Rabbi Yoshiya does not seem to agree with that because he seems to say if you didn't have 3 verses, you wouldn't, 3 different times it says Elohim, you wouldn't necessarily know that you need 3 judges, which would imply that Rabbi Yoshiya seems to hold you could use a court that is even. Now, you can't use a court of 2 because ultimately he has drashot that say 3. You need 3. But if you're allowed to use an even number of judges, which seems to be the implication of Rabbi Yoshiya based on the fact that he requires 3 drashot, and it's not enough like Rabbi Yonatan to just have 2 and rely on the fact that it can't be an even number, it needs to be an odd number, so then it would emerge seemingly that Rabbi Yoshiya would hold that you can have a court that's more than 3, even if it's an even number. For example, says Rashi, you can have a court of 4, or you can have a court of 6. The fact that he needs 3 special drashot, and you can't just rely on the drasha of needing to have an odd number, seems to be you can have an even number, according to Rabbi Yoshiya, at least in monetary cases, says the Gemara. So it would appear that Rabbi Yoshiya would hold 4 and 6 would be sufficient, or 8 would be sufficient for a monetary court case. You can have 4 or 6 judges. Based on that, the Gemara says, but we had a drasha that says it has to be an odd number. So why does Rabbi Yoshiya seem to hold otherwise? Asks the Gemara, Rabbi Yoshiya letle beitin noteh. Does Rabbi Yoshiya not hold that a beitin needs to be able to tilt? It needs to be an odd number, that it's necessary? Fahatanya, we have a braita that teaches, Rabbi Eliezer ben Osher Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, taught the following. Ma Talmud Lomar, what does it mean when the pasuk talks about courts? It says, lintot acharei rabim latot. It's a double language. It says to tilt or to imbalance. Acharei rabim latot, follow after the majority, latot, to tilt. It uses this word to tilt or an imbalance 2 times. Why does it use that word twice? Says Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi, it's teaching us an emphasis. HaTorah Amra, the Torah is teaching us, Aseh lecha beitin noteh, that you have to have a court that could tilt. What do you mean that it could tilt? It has to be an odd number. Says the Gemara, but according to the way we're learning Rabbi Yoshiya now, he doesn't seem to hold of that. Does he not hold of that drasha? It seems to be a very logical conclusion based on that pasuk that it has to be an odd number. But based on the fact that Rabbi Yoshiya needs 3 psukim, it seems to be otherwise you would be able to rely on an even number. But you can't because we just had a drasha. The double language of tilting means it has to be an odd number. So the Gemara answers no. Rabbi Yoshiya does hold that a court could be an even number. Oh, where does he get that from? We have a precedent. Remember, we learned in the Mishnah how many people was on the great Sanhedrin, the great one, which was illustrated in the Psukim when HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe to gather 70 elders. So the Tanakama said, The fact that he said gather 70 elders and Moshe was one, so that's 71. But Rabbi Yehuda said you could have 70 because Moshe Rabbeinu is not included, and therefore the Sanhedrin Agdolah was actually 70 people. You could have an even Beit Din. So Rabbi Yoshiya will hold like Rabbi Yehuda, you could have a even number, just as by the biggest Sanhedrin, also by a 3-person court, you could theoretically adjudicate monetary cases with 4 or 6. Let's read that inside. Savar like Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yoshiya holds like Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar, who says, Shivim, that you could have 70 for the big Sanhedrin. The Tanah, like the Mishnah previously on Bet Amud Aleph told us, Sanhedrin Gdola, the big Sanhedrin, Aitashal Shivim Be'echad, was 71. That was the Tanakama's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says, Shivim, you could have 70. He expounded from the Psukim, that as it says over there, you could have 70, Moshe is not included. Therefore, the Sanhedrin Gdola could be 70. Also, a lower court of monetary cases could be 4. And Rabbi Yoshiya has someone to rely on. But says the Gemara, you can't prove from there. Rabbi Yoshiya can't rely on that shita because Eimar d'shamat le Rabbi Yehuda. When did Rabbi Yehuda hold B'Sanhedrin Gdola that you can have an even number? That's specifically by the great Sanhedrin. D'chtiv ikrai, because you have psukim that imply that. Meaning the pasuk here implies it says shivim, that Hashem said gather 70. Rabbi Yehuda deduces from that you can have an even number of 70 when it comes to the big Sanhedrin. But b'shar beidina misham atle, by a monetary court, by other courts, how do you know to apply the same principle? Maybe it's only true by the big Sanhedrin, but by monetary courts, who says you can rely on that? Maybe you have to have an odd number so that there could be a leaning in one direction. How can Rabbi Yoshiya hold this way? Says the Gemara, V'chi tema, maybe you'll answer, Loshna, there's no distinction. Means maybe you'll say, just as Rabbi Yehuda holds regarding the big Sanhedrin, it could be an even number, he also holds regarding a monetary court, it could be an even number. We know that's not true, because in the Mishnah itself it says, V'atanan, in our Mishnah, it said, Smichad zkenim b'arifat eglah. This case of smichat zkenim, which is when the courts paskin that something is permitted and most of the Jews, the Sanhedrin paskin something is permitted and most of the Jews engage in it, they have to bring a special korban called par ha'elem davar shel tzibur, and they lean on its head and then they shecht it. Varifat eglah, that's talking about the scenario where dead bodies found, they decapitate a calf, but they would measure it, these Sanhedrin would measure. So how many of the Sanhedrin would engage in these two activities? So the Mishnah said, Vishlosha div Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said you need 3 of the Sanhedrin to engage in these behaviors. Again, leaning on the animal and measuring the dead body to which city it's closer. Rabbi Yehuda himself says, B'chamisha, that you need 5 of the Zkenim to engage in it. Now why does he hold this way? Va'amrina, and the Gemara later on Yud Gimel Mabed is going to say, my time is Rabbi Yehuda. Why does he hold you need 5? In regards to leaning on the animal, because the pasuk says in this scenario of smichat zkenim, it says v'samchu, they shall lean, means some of the Sanhedrin shall lean on that animal before it's slaughtered, and samchu is plural. So he deduces as follows: samchu means shnayim, you need 2 of the judges to engage in leaning on it. Then it says ziknei, the elders, s at the end, plural, again plural, shnayim, that's another 2. Which means that you would need 4. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Ve'ein beit din shakul. You can't have an equal court. So mosifin alein od echad. They'd have to add on another one. Hare kan hey. So you see that you need 5. So what do you see clearly? Although Rabbi Yehuda does not seem to hold of the principle of having an odd number when it comes to the big Sanhedrin, you could have 70, but by the lower courts, by the monetary courts, for example, he does hold of this principle because he only knows 4 from the psukim when it comes to leaning on the neck of the animal before being slaughtered in the case of smichat zkenim, and he relies on the principle of having an odd number in order to add the 5th. So clearly Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that you can apply the same principle to lower courts. How can Rabbi Yoshiya apply the same principle of Rabbi Yehuda to a monetary court and say that you can have an even number when it comes to a monetary court? So the Gemara answers, no problem. You're assuming Rabbi Yoshiya has to be like the position entirely of Rabbi Yehuda. He actually extends Rabbi Yehuda's principle beyond what Rabbi Yehuda holds. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Yoshiya adifa mid Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yoshiya actually extends this principle more than Rabbi Yehuda extends it. The ilu Rabbi Yehuda b'Sanhedrin gdola hu deletle. Rabbi Yehuda only holds that it does not have to be an odd number by the large Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin. You can have an even number there of 70. But by all other courts he holds that it would have to be an odd number. So therefore, by a monetary court, certainly it would have to be 3 people. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. For Rabbi Yoshiya takes that same principle. Bishar beidina nami letle. He holds in other courts as well, meaning just as in the Sanhedrin Gdolah, it could be 70, it could be an even number. Also in monetary courts, it could be an even number of 4. And therefore, other than the fact that it says Elohim 3 times, which means you need 3, actually it would be an even number. You wouldn't know just by the fact that it could be an odd number. And based on that, actually, if it was 4 or 6, it would be sufficient for a monetary court. Says the Gemara, okay, but then how do you expound the verse? We have a verse, we just said it says lintot 2 times in the pasuk, and the pasuk therefore is teaching us you need an odd number, an imbalanced number of people to judge cases. So what would Rabbi Yoshiya then use that for? If the great courts and the smaller courts don't require odd numbers, so when do you utilize this pasuk? So what does Rabbi Yoshiya then use lintot to teach us? The Gemara answers, Mokim la b'dinei nefashot. He uses it for capital courts. Courts of 23, for capital cases. Regarding capital cases there, you're going to need to have a majority in order to adjudicate that case, which means you're going to have an odd number. As Rashi explains over here, b'dinei nefashot, that in order for a capital case to be judged, in order to tilt in the side of favor, there you're going to need the one majority in order to paskin that he's innocent. And if it was an even number, so then you wouldn't be able to do that. That's the point. Fine. So therefore, what emerges according to Rabbi Yoshiya is you could use an even number for the big court, for the monetary courts. The only time that you need an odd number is when it comes to dinei nefashot. That's what the pasuk is really teaching us when it comes to capital cases. Asks the Gemara, aval b'dinei mamonot lo. But when it comes to monetary cases, does he not require an odd number? Now, the way Rashi explains this next question is as follows. Assuming Rabbi Yoshiya does not require an odd number for monetary cases, the Gemara says, now, if you hold that it could even be an even number for monetary cases, that means you could have 4, for example. So it would emerge then that you can't rely on a majority in order to paskin when it comes to monetary cases because you won't necessarily have a majority. So Rashi says, based on that, it would seem to be that in order to paskin, you would need all of them, all of the judges to paskin in a certain direction. Yet, the Mishnah tells us later on Chavtet Amud Aleph, the Mishnah says, Shnayim omrim zakai. If 2 people say that a person is innocent, I'm talking about a monetary case, ve'echad omer chayav, and one says that he's guilty, zakai. So the halacha is, we rely on the people who are saying he's innocent, and he's innocent. Shnayim omrim chayav. If 2 people say that he is liable, ve'echad omer zakai, and one says that he's innocent, chayav. So then he's going to be guilty because 2 people said he's guilty. So Naaman would seem to appear then, if Rabbi Yoshiya does not require to have an odd number, that means Mistama he would hold, that Rashi assumes, that he would hold, as the Gemara is assuming, that all of them would have to paskin in one direction to lean in that way. But the Mishnah here says you don't need all, you just need a majority. So Naaman Deloka Rabbi Yoshiya, it would appear then that this Mishnah does not follow the position of Rabbi Yoshiya. So the Gemara answers and says, no, that's not necessarily true. Afilu Tem Rabbi Yoshiya, the Mishnah could even be like Rabbi Yoshiya. Why? Meaning Rabbi Yoshiya would hold, even though you could have an even number for a monetary court, that's what we're concluding according to Rabbi Yoshiya, nonetheless, a majority would still sway the decision. You don't need them all paskening in one direction. How does he know that? Because he derives it based on a kal v'chomer, a very simple logical conclusion from capital cases. Regarding capital cases, which is much more strict, a person could be put to death. Amar Rabanan, and the Torah says, Yilbataruba, as we've concluded, you do follow the majority according to Rabbi Yoshiya as well. You don't need them all to paskin in one direction, you follow majority. So certainly monetary cases which are less strict, they're more lenient, certainly you should follow the majority. You don't need them all to paskin in that direction in order to follow the psak of the Beit Din. So therefore the Gemara says in the bottom line, according to Rabbi Yoshiya, seemingly it would appear this idea, you actually would be allowed to have an even court for the Sanhedrin Agadol, as well as for a 3-person court. The only time you're not allowed to is in regards to the dinei nefashot, seemingly for a 23-person court. However, we still would rely on the majority when it comes to a 3-person court. You'd be allowed to rely on a majority. You don't need them all to paskin in one direction in order to follow the psak. Okay, let's move on now to the second section of the day. Now, we have been assuming until now, everyone agrees that when it comes to a monetary court, you need 3 people in order to adjudicate monetary cases. The Gemara is about to introduce to us a braita where we have a different opinion, which is Rebbi. He says you actually need 5. It's a chidush. So let's see. Tanu Rabanan says the braita, Dine mamunot bishlosha. So the Tanakama, the first opinion of the braita, says that monetary cases are adjudicated with 3 judges. Rebbi Omer, Rebbi says b'chamisha, you need 5 judges. Why? Now Rebbi says something very cryptic. We're going to have to understand what he's saying, but he says, Kedei sheyigamer adin bishlosha. In order that you can paskin the halacha or conclude the halacha with 3. Now it would appear what he's saying is, the idea is that you need to have a majority, not just a majority of 1 or 2 in order to sway, but you need a majority of 3 in order to paskin when it comes to monetary cases. So if you have 5, you could have a majority of 3. So the Gemara says, I understand. If it's just an inyan of having a majority, why do you need a majority of 3? Etu betlata milo gamar dina betrei. Even if you have a court of 3, you'll still have a majority. 2 versus 1 is also a majority. So why is that a reason to have 5 so that you conclude the court case with 3? So the Gemara answers, Achikama. Rebbi is saying, no, Rebbi is actually saying unequivocally, he's saying, what is the halacha? Mipnei shegmar din b'shlosha. In order to paskin halacha by dinei mamonot, there needs to be 3 people on one side in order to sway the decision. Which means that in order to conclude, you need to have 5 to begin with so that there is a total of 3 at the end, paskining in one direction and to follow that psak. That's what Rebbi is really holding. So the Gemara says, why would he assume this? So the assumption the Gemara is making is like this. We know it says Elohim 3 times. And we know until now we've been assuming either like Rabbi Yoshiya, each one is expounded for number, or like Rabbi Yonatan, which we're actually going to go more with over here. 2 of them are expounded for number. 1 of them is added because you can't have an equal court. So the Gemara says that would be like the Tanakama. 3 is based on the fact that it says Elohim 2 times, add a 3rd. According to Rebbi, it would seem to appear that's not how he expounds Elohim. Elohim is expounded 3 times that you need 3 people paskining in one direction in conclusion in order to follow that direction. That appears to be how Rebbi is deriving you need 5. Alma kasava, you see that Rebbi holds tlata kiktivi when it says Elohim 3 times. Bigmar dinaktivi. It's talking about the fact that at the end and conclusion, you need 3 people paskining in one direction in order to follow that, which means then you need 5 because it also has to be a majority. Problem is, Megadif bar Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Avo, no, Megadif either means he castigated against this or he was surprised by this conclusion. He said this is not logical because the way you're saying it then is that the verses imply you need 3. Rebbi then is saying it means you need 3 paskining in that direction and therefore you need a total of 5 so that there's 3 versus 2 so that 3 is the majority. The problem is you'll have to apply this by the other courts too, which we certainly don't do because Elameata, according to what you're saying, we know that the Psukim say you need, in the Great Sanhedrin, 71. So Tehei Sanhedrin Gdola Tzricha Meyava 41. In order to have a majority paskining based on the number that is listed in the Pasuk of Sanhedrin Gdola, you'll need 141 because you'll need 71 in one direction and 70 in the other direction. So that the psak din is determined based on 71 in the direction that you'll follow over 70. And similarly, the lower courts that are capital, you'll need 45. If the number 3 is alluding to how much you need at the end in order to paskin in that direction, so then for a 23-person court, really you need 23 people paskining in the way you're going to go, which means you'll actually need 45. That's not the halacha, clearly. So the Gemara says, Ella, rather obviously, how do we understand the verses? By the big Sanhedrin, it says, Esfali shivim ish. It says, gather 70 people, plus Moshe is 71. Amachmana, the Torah is saying, Misha'at asifa shivim. When they gather to begin the process, it has to be 71. And similarly, v'shaftu ha'eda, v'tzilu ha'eda, as we explained in the Mishnah, the Drasha, Eda means 10 plus Eda means 10 plus another 2, because you need 2 on top of that in the direction of negativity, to indict, that's 22. Add another 1 because it can't be an even court, therefore it needs to be 23. Nami mishat shifitat ha'eda. Again, it also means when they begin adjudicating, not in conclusion you need that many in order to sway the courts. Sachinami, the Gemara says also here, it should be the same thing. What's Rebbi saying? V'nikrav balabayat el Elohim, when it says in the pasuk Elohim 3 times, mishat krevash lasha, you should need 3 in the beginning of the process when they gather to adjudicate. Not at the end you need 3 in order to paskin in that direction. So how do we understand Rebbi's position over here? It seems to be very difficult. So the Gemara is about to say a different pshat in Rebbi. Why does Rebbi require 5? So let me just speak this out and we'll see it inside. Rebbi is going to require 5 because he's going to say as follows. The word Elohim, as the word sounds actually, is either plural or singular. The word Elohim could be plural, Elohim. With singular could be Elohecha, I guess. Or Elohei, Elohecha. Elohim is plural. But it also in the psukim refers to a singular. Like we refer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as Elohim, he is singular. So the same word could either be plural or singular. Rebbi is going to say, as we'll see in a moment, based on the context, the Elohims here have to be interpreted plural. So therefore, if you add it together, you can't darshan the first one because we seem to be following Ein Dorshin Tchilot. We don't expound the first one. So you have the second one and the third one. If each one's plural, that's 4. Since you can't have an equal court, it'll be 5. Beautiful, that's Rebbi. Tanakama holds Elohim is singular. You look at it in a singular format, and therefore you have 2. Can't have an even court, so it's going to be 3. Now, how do we get there? So the Gemara says because the third time it says Elohim, it says Elohim, Yarshiyun Elohim. Now Yarshiyun, they shall indict, is clearly plural. So Rebbi says, let's read that inside. Elohainu time at the Rebbi. The reason of Rebbi is as follows: Asher Yarshiyun Elohim Trey. Yarshiyun is clearly plural, so therefore the Elohim, the noun attached to that verb, is also looked at as plural. That's 2 judges. Ne'emar Elohim lemata. It says Elohim there below, but Ne'emar Elohim lemala, and it says Elohim right before in the pasuk. Ad Elohim yavot var shnehem, and therefore we compare them. Ma lemata shnayim, just as Asher Yarshiyun Elohim, says Rebbi, clearly refers to 2 because Yarshiyun is plural. So the Elohim that it's modifying is also plural. So too, when it comes to the Elohim above, meaning earlier in the verse, it also is 2. And you can't have an equal court, so 4 wouldn't be an option. Therefore, says Rebbi, you add on 1 more. Therefore, you have a total of 5. That's how he knows that you need 5. Turning to Daled Amud Aleph, the Rabanan in the Tanakama who argues and says you have 3, so he expounds differently. Because if you look in the Torah, Yarshiyun, which is written next to that third Elohim, is actually written without a vav between the shin and the nun, shun. So it could be read Yarshi'an. Yarshi'an would mean singular, or he shall indict. Since the verse doesn't say a vav there, it's telling us it's to be interpreted in a singular sense, and therefore Yarshi'an ktiv, since it says Yarshi'an, it's interpreted singular. The Elohim attached to it is singular, which means the earlier Elohim is also singular. Again, you don't expound the first one because that's necessary, bichlal, to teach us that you have professional judges, smuchin, and therefore you only have 2, says the Tanakama. If you only have 2, then you'll add a third because you can't have an even court to judge even monetary matters. Now we're going to stop here, but let me just explain what the Gemara is about to do, because really it's important to understand this before we break. Really, what is this contingent on? Clearly in the Torah it does say Arshi'un without a vav. So this is expounded, as the Gemara will show momentarily, based on a machloket throughout Shas. Yesh em lemesoret or yesh em lemikra. If we have a word in the Torah that could either be interpreted in its misoret, which is its written form, meaning the way it's written, not the way we traditionally read it, that's the mikra, but based on the way it is actually written, in this context, Yarshi'an, like the Rabanan say, that's how we're going to expound it. So therefore the Rabanan say, Yesh em lemesoret, it's written in the way Yarshi'an, because there's no vav there in the Torah, and therefore it means singular. Rebbi, on the other hand, holds yesh em lemikra. The way we expound, we give primacy. We expound psukim based on mikra, which is the way we actually read it. How do you actually read it? Yarshi'un. Yarshi'un is plural, and therefore we'll expound the word yarshi'un for plural. Thus we get 4 plus 1 is going to be 5. This machloket yesh em lemikra, yesh em lemesoret is going to be the discussion for the rest of this Amud, God willing. We'll get to that next time with the Dalet Amud Aleph. Stop at the top of Dalet Amud Aleph, pick up with Dalet Amud Aleph tomorrow. In the meantime, everybody have a wonderful day, Shabbat Shalom, and all the best.